It was August 13th, 2018 when I first saw the footage. Chris Watts stood on his neighbor's porch, arms crossed tightly across his chest, shifting on his heels as the security camera replayed. The morning his pregnant wife and two young daughters vanished. At first glance, he looked like any suburban husband, concerned, cooperative, but there was something about his eyes. They blinked too fast. They darted too much. As a psychologist, I've studied that look. It's the look of someone trying to remember which version of their story they told last. That day, America watched in horror as a man who once posted smiling family photos became the face of an unthinkable tragedy. Chris Watts murdered his pregnant wife Shanann and their two daughters Bella and Celeste. He strangled Shanann in their bedroom. Then he drove her body along with his sleeping children to an oil site where he worked. There he smothered both girls and hid their bodies in crude oil tanks. 3 lives taken in silence. No gunshot, no scream, just quiet, premeditated destruction. What drove a man with no criminal record, a steady job, and a seemingly normal marriage to commit such an act of intimate annihilation? The answer, I believe, begins long before the crime, before the marriage, before the children. It starts in places most people forget to look. In childhood silences, repressed desires, and years of smiling through disconnection. In this story, we'll trace the long, invisible descent, not to excuse, but to understand, because understanding is how we prevent the next tragedy. And if there's one thing I've learned after decades of studying the minds of killers, it's this: monsters don't start as monsters. Sometimes they begin as little boys with eyes that never really learned how to cry. They say childhood is where the soul gets its first scars. With Chris Watts, those scars were invisible, but they ran deep. I've spent hours reviewing his early life. There was no open trauma, no beatings, no shouting matches captured on old VHS tapes. On the surface, it all looked ordinary, stable, even loving. But clinical experience has taught me to look for what isn't said. Chris was the quiet one, the obedient one, the child who made no trouble. His mother, by many accounts, was strong-willed, controlling. Perfection mattered, not just in grades, but in how emotions were shown, or more precisely, how they weren't. Chris learned early that being good meant being silent. That sadness should be tucked away. That anger should never be spoken out loud. Imagine that. A young boy building emotional calluses not from abuse, but from a lack of room to feel. No space for rawness, no permission for weakness. Instead, he found approval in compliance. He got praised for being easy, for not making waves. And so he learned the cost of love, self-erasure. This is often where the first deviation begins, not with violence, but with disconnection. Not from others, but from oneself. He grew up not quite knowing what he wanted, only what others needed from him. And in that quiet confusion, the first fracture formed. A split between the outer boy, the one who smiled, who nodded, who followed the rules, and the inner child who had no voice, no space, no name. Years later, people would ask, why didn't we see it coming? But in truth, the warning signs weren't loud. They were whispered from the very start in a boy's eyes that reflected back only what others wanted to see. In school, Chris Watts faded into the background like a shadow against the wall. Not bullied, not admired, just unnoticed. Teachers described him as polite, quiet, always respectful. He never raised his hand unless called upon. He never got in trouble. But behind that good behavior there was something hollow, a detachment, as if Chris was watching life happen from behind glass. This kind of emotional dissociation is subtle, but it leaves a mark. A child who never feels seen begins to question whether they truly exist beyond their usefulness. Chris excelled at math and mechanics, but his classmates rarely remembered him. And those who did remembered only the silence. He wasn't the star athlete. He wasn't the class clown. He was just there, present but not part of the picture. And that absence of belonging can become a quiet agony. In my field, we often talk about social mirrors, how we come to understand ourselves through others' eyes. But what happens when no one truly looks? When connection is shallow, transactional, or non-existent? I suspect that for Chris, school wasn't a place of learning who he was. It was a place where he learned who he wasn't. He wasn't charismatic, wasn't strong, wasn't wanted. So instead, he became invisible, a shape that conformed, a face that reflected only what others wanted. The first abandonment wasn't a person, it was the slow erosion of identity. 1,000 tiny moments of being overlooked, misunderstood, or ignored. People think pain has to be loud to be real, but sometimes the deepest wounds are the quiet ones, the ones buried beneath years of forced smiles and silent lunches, the ones that grow roots in isolation and bloom later as something unrecognizable. Puberty is a turning point. For most, it's a time of discovery of identity, desire, rebellion. But for someone like Chris Watts, who had learned to suppress himself for so long, it became a quiet war between who he was and who he was told to be. He didn't act out. He didn't party or date much or push boundaries the way most teens do. Instead, he stayed small, predictable, safe. But inside, a split had begun. This is the age where emotional independence tries to take root. But Chris had no soil for that. He didn't yet know how to feel angry without guilt. He didn't know how to desire without shame. So instead of exploring who he truly was, he perfected the mask. He became obsessed with control, fitness, routine, small things he could master in a world that felt emotionally ungraspable. I've seen this before. When inner chaos is disallowed, external order becomes a substitute. The more lost someone feels inside, the more tightly they grip whatever they can manage. It's also the age when fantasies begin to fill the void, fantasies of being loved perfectly, being seen completely. Chris never voiced his, but over time, the gap between his inner self and outer image widened. There's a kind of psychological numbness that forms when you never test the boundaries of your emotions. Chris didn't deviate in the traditional sense. He wasn't violent, but he began to drift, away from reality, toward illusion, toward a life where he could script everything, his image, his future, his relationships. To the world, he was still the nice guy, but in the quiet, his real self was fading, and something colder was learning how to survive in its place. By the time Chris Watts reached adulthood, he had become a master of appearances. On the outside, he was everything society applauds: responsible, polite, dependable. He worked hard, stayed fit, paid his bills. He didn't drink excessively, didn't get into fights, didn't draw attention. But that's the thing about masks, they're most effective when no one suspects they're there. Chris had learned that if you give people what they want, they stop asking who you really are. He didn't charm with charisma, but with consistency. He was the guy who showed up, the guy who followed through, and in a world that craves stability, that was enough to keep him unquestioned. Then came Shanann. She was vibrant, driven, outspoken, everything he wasn't. Some say opposites attract. I say masks are drawn to mirrors. Shanann saw in Chris someone steady, someone who wouldn't compete with her fire. And Chris saw in her a life that looked like happiness. Together they built the image, the marriage, the children, the new house, the smiling social media posts. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. You see, when you never develop a strong inner self, you become what others need. And when those needs change, you panic. Shanann was strong, demanding. She wanted emotional intimacy, growth, engagement. And Chris, he didn't know how to give that. Not because he didn't want to, but because no one had ever taught him how. So he withdrew, quietly, smiling, nodding, fixing things around the house instead of fixing himself. He became invisible again, but this time within his own life. No one noticed, not really, because the mask worked. It always had. And when a person disappears behind their mask for too long, they start to believe that they are the lie. Every unraveling has a moment, a single shift that snaps the illusion. For Chris Watts, that moment was not one blow, it was a quiet accumulation. And then, a spark. It began when Shanann sensed distance. She was intuitive. She asked questions. She posted affirmations online, but those close to the family said they were struggling. Financial strain, emotional disconnection. an overwhelming household where communication had thinned into silence. And then Nicole Kessinger. She wasn't just an affair, she was an escape route, a mirror that reflected back the version of Chris he longed to be: free, desirable, unburdened. With Nicole, he wasn't a husband or a father. He was new, rewritten, and most of all, wanted. That psychologically is dangerous for someone like Chris, someone who has spent his life molding himself for others. Nicole gave him a fantasy: the clean slate, a life where he didn't have to carry years of emotional responsibility, where he didn't have to face the truth of himself. So when Shanann returned from a business trip that August weekend, things were already on edge. She was pregnant, their third child. Another life he hadn't chosen, another layer of pressure, of permanence. To someone with a fragmented sense of self-reality, can feel unbearable when it threatens the fantasy. In psychology, we call it a break in narrative identity, the moment a person can no longer reconcile who they are with who they pretend to be. That night, something shifted. We may never know the exact moment, but it was in the stillness of his mind that a decision grew, not sudden, not explosive, but cold. To protect the fantasy, the lie had to become complete. And to do that, everything real had to disappear. I've studied dozens of confessions. I've listened to the hesitations, the contradictions, the desperate need to explain the unexplainable. Chris Watts's confession is one of the quietest. That's what haunts me. He didn't rage, he didn't cry. He spoke of murder like recounting a dream, foggy, detached, incomplete. But if you listen between the words, you begin to hear something else, a deep, numbing vacancy. In the early morning hours of August 13th, Chris said he and Shanann argued. But it wasn't the kind of argument that escalates, it was the kind that simmers. And at some point in the silence of that tension, he decided. He wrapped his hands around her neck and didn't stop until she was gone. He said it felt like a blankness. He described it like watching himself. That's classic psychological dissociation, a moment when the mind detaches from reality, often to protect itself from unbearable emotion. But it can also be a kind of release. For someone like Chris, whose identity was built on suppression, that moment may have felt paradoxically liberating. Not powerful in the way people imagine. There was no thrill, no dominance, but rather a surrender, a giving in to something dark he had long denied existed. And yet, it didn't end there. His daughters were still alive. Bella and Celeste. Small, trusting. He drove with them for nearly an hour. What goes through a man's mind in that time? Was there hesitation? A flicker of guilt? Possibly. But fantasy is fragile, and to preserve it, reality had to vanish, even the part that called him daddy. Chris wasn't consumed by rage. He was consumed by escape. And when escape is all someone can see, they'll destroy anything that reminds them of the life they're running from, even love. After the crime, Chris Watts did what so many killers don't. He returned to normal almost flawlessly. He texted friends, he joked with neighbors, he did interviews asking for help finding his missing family, and he stood in front of cameras, eyes wide, voice steady. To the public it was chilling, but to a psychologist it was deeply revealing. This wasn't the behavior of a seasoned criminal, it was the behavior of a man clinging to a fantasy that had already shattered. Chris didn't run, he didn't lash out, he didn't confess right away. Instead, he performed. Like he always had. He thought if he kept smiling, if he acted like the grieving husband, he could maintain the illusion long enough to step into his new life. With Nicole, with freedom. But something inside him had changed. Not in the way people think. He didn't become heartless overnight. What I saw, and what the polygraphs later confirmed, was a kind of psychological collapse. His answers were flat, his emotions mismatched. He cried when talking about himself, not about his family. That's not evil, it's dissociation, a defense mechanism the mind uses when faced with unbearable truth. But dissociation doesn't last forever. When the evidence mounted Shanann's phone, the neighbor's footage, the inconsistencies, Chris broke, and not with fury, not even with sadness. He simply deflated, as if the mask he'd spent his entire life wearing had finally lost its grip. Was he cold? Yes, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't a predator's coldness, it was an emptiness, an emotional void that had slowly expanded for decades until there was nothing left to hold the weight of what he had done. And when that void meets reality, even monsters can crumble. When Chris Watts finally confessed, it wasn't cinematic, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, hesitant, almost childlike. He shifted in his chair. His voice cracked. He stared down at his hands. And for a moment, just a flicker, I saw something in his eyes that I rarely see in killers. Not remorse, not grief, confusion. He seemed genuinely lost, as if the person sitting there in that interrogation room wasn't him, like he'd woken up inside someone else's nightmare and didn't know how he got there. This is what fascinates me most about Chris, not the crime, but the aftermath. Because when you look closely, you begin to see the boy beneath the man. The one who was never taught how to feel without fear. The one who spent his whole life pleasing, pretending, performing. Now stripped of the mask, all that remained was emptiness. In prison interviews, he spoke softly. He quoted scripture. He said he felt God had forgiven him, but what struck me wasn't his words, it was how hard he tried to sound like someone who had made peace. That's the final mask, the redemption mask. But eyes don't lie. There's a vacancy in them now, a dullness, like a television left on after the show ends, light without meaning. I don't think he understands what he did not truly. He knows the facts, but the emotional reality, the weight of it, it floats above him, never settling. And that's the haunting part. He isn't a monster in the traditional sense. He's a man who erased everything he claimed to love, not in rage, but in retreat. So yes, he's still human. But sometimes the most frightening thing of all is what a human can do when they feel like they've already disappeared. People ask me all the time, could this have been prevented? And the answer isn't simple. There were no criminal records, no history of violence, no loud warnings. Just a man who smiled in every photo, who mowed the lawn, played with his daughters, sent "I love you" texts to his wife. But sometimes the most dangerous storms are the quiet ones. Chris Watts didn't snap in a moment. He eroded over time. Years of emotional suppression, of never developing a real identity, of pleasing to survive. And when life demanded depth, vulnerability, responsibility, truth, he didn't have the tools. So he escaped the only way he knew how. Not by running away, but by erasing the life he couldn't hold anymore. Could we have stopped it? Maybe. If we learned to notice the quiet ones. If we stopped mistaking silence for stability. If we asked our boys how they feel, not just how they perform. If we taught emotional literacy the way we teach math. If we made it safe to say "I'm lost" before they find themselves standing in a courtroom, eyes vacant, lives shattered. This story isn't just about Chris Watts. It's about the pressure to be perfect, the fear of failure, the masks we wear to be loved, and what happens when no one sees the cracks forming beneath the surface. I don't share this to forgive him. I share it to understand, because only through understanding can we prevent the next family photo from becoming a headline. So the next time you see someone who's doing just fine, look again. And maybe you'll see the eyes that are quietly asking for help.